Hi everyone, this is Jen. I'll be your discussion host for this week. We're going to talk about Indigenous community planning and self-determinism based on a paper by Ted Hohola from the University of New Mexico. And even though it is mostly based on Indigenous in the United States, it was published in the Canadian Journal of Urban Research and does make some reference to Canada, so I thought it would be reasonably relevant. Some highlights of the paper were a little bit of history about the Indigenous, self-determinism, which I will define for you shortly, financial innovations and independence for tribes, and traditional ecological knowledge in planning, community planning, and the required adaptations for Indigenous who go down that road. So some history, I think it's important to note that the permanent settlement aspect to community planning is relatively new to the Indigenous in comparison with their European counterparts. Many Indigenous tribes were mostly nomadic, which is a different sort of community planning. They would migrate along routes that were similar to perhaps the bison they were hunting. They did a lot of foraging. They certainly put up shelters that were probably semi-permanent, but just not in the same way that Europeans did. So when they were forced into permanent settlement by the European settlers, that changed their relationship to the land, where now they were forced to attempt farming and cultivation, waste management. Their medical needs would have changed by being clustered so close with other tribes. And then the assignment of individual lands, like individual property as we have now, would have also been new as compared to communal tribal land. So it was in the 1800s that the European settlers gained the upper hand over the Indigenous and started forcing them into reservations, where they were often forced with warring tribes and were too crowded and weren't properly provided for and couldn't hunt for themselves, and it was terrible. And it wasn't until 1928 with the Miriam Report that the US government relented on this point and began to try to restore some of the native lands and improve life for Indigenous people in general. In 61, a conference was organized by some Indigenous scholars to get the Indigenous perspective from different tribes from around the countryside about how helpful the government was being since 1928 when they did the Miriam Report, and where improvement could be made. And since it seemed that they weren't being very helpful, the attendees at this conference drafted the Declaration of Purpose on Indian Policy, which was eventually presented to JFK at the White House. And this was the beginning of Indigenous self-determination. So self-determinism or self-determination is essentially just as it sounds. It's about power and choice lying with the Indigenous rather than with the government or with the external non-Indigenous members of the country or state. So on Indigenous land, it is the tribe's right to decide how the land is used, who lives on it, what sort of educational models and curriculum they want, what language they'll speak, what their medical care system should look like, and so on and so forth. It's all just up to the tribe. That's what they mean when they say self-determinism. Now, my favorite part of the paper was about something I called the casino innovation or the gaming innovation, which started in the 70s with this brilliant little tribe called the Seminole, I think is how that's pronounced, Seminole, who decided that they needed to make some jobs and make some money, and they were going to do that by running bingo games and inviting the surrounding non-Indigenous to join them and play. And it worked so well that by the 80s, tribes were doing it all over the place, all over the US games, and casinos were popping up and becoming pretty high stake, good money making endeavors. State and local governments were dead set against this. They were trying to suppress it constantly by taking tribes to court and declaring that their gambling activities were illegal. But tribes held their ground and insisted that it was a matter of sovereignty and they weren't subject to the same government laws as everyone else and could do what they wanted on their own land. And in 1987, a small tribe called the Cabazon went head to head with the state of California at the Supreme Court over this exact issue and won. By 2002, nearly half of the tribes in the US have casinos or gaming, cornering 20% of the domestic gaming market, for a total of $14.5 billion industry. And this is so significant because self-determination is only partly design, and the other part is execution, and execution requires monetary power. So you can make any healthcare system you want, or any education system you want, or any waste management system you want, but if you don't have the money to pay for it, then it's just not going to happen. Government funding tends to fall grossly short of the requirement on reserves. And the only other way that reserves could make money in the past was by leasing out their land for its resources. So maybe a tribe would um, give a 10-year lease to a mining company of a section of their land so that they could drill for oil on it or dig for gold or whatever, which probably didn't leave the tribe very happy, even if they were making some money in the exchange. But there were many tribes that couldn't even do that because they didn't wind up on a reservation that had rich enough land to be of interest to companies to rent. So the gaming innovation was a really excellent example of making something out of nothing, so to speak. And that revenue enabled many tribes, not all tribes have done this, but enabled many indigenous to fill those gaps that the government funding had left and provide their members the health care, education, improved housing, so on and so forth. And some tribes that were particularly smart about it even used many of the proceeds um, to invest externally in stocks, further strengthening and stabilizing their economies. This is quoted directly out of the paper. I wanted to read it to you. The basic premise behind comprehensive planning is the orderly progression of development, as well as the future determination of community goals and aspirations. Usually, the two conditions that provoke governments to enable planning are the need to manage growth and the need to regulate land use in a manner that formulates public policy for the orderly placement of roads, houses, industries, and commerce. Tribes, though, have the additional goal of pursuing a style of sustainable development that balances their ecological and cultural value systems with that of their economic pursuits. So, to summarize that, basically, the European inherited approach to planning is very strategic and corporate and essentially mostly just considers the people involved and the present. So, what's the present public welfare? Who currently owns the land? How much will it cost to buy it? How much can we maximize its capital value by developing it and potentially wrecking the ecosystem there? And how much can we sell it for? Or at what point will we have to sell it? And you'll see all over the place these abandoned buildings that have lost their value in people's eyes, and they don't even bother to clean them up after they leave them. The indigenous approach is far more comprehensive. where land use is still based on tribal welfare and people, but it's also based on culture and tradition. It's based on the ecosystem, what's sustainable there, on the honorable harvest, which is a philosophy of never extracting a resource to its entirety, never exhausting a resource, always leaving it in a state where it can recover itself and provide for the future generation or the future year. And then also this rule of 7 generations, which I just learned about with this paper. It's really cool, where a tribe will consider the the members from 7 generations back and 7 generations forward when considering community planning and land use. So what will the ancestors think of this, and are we following in their footsteps adequately? And what will the future generation think of this? Are we leaving them a legacy and something useful, or are we creating a problem for them? Really comprehensive viewpoint. But at the same time, it's a very challenging matter. It's not just the challenge of balancing corporate strategy with comprehensive tradition, and there does have to be some sort of corporate strategy, um, because after all, we are still sharing the land together, the European settlers and the indigenous. Um, and there are lots of things that they buy from us and that we buy from them. So there does need to be a certain amount of economy. There needs to be a certain amount of corporate strategy. To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, I'm not an expert, but I don't think there are any tribes trying to fully return to the traditions they once held of being nomadic and non-farming, and not doing things like digging up stone basements and creating brick houses and stuff. I don't think there are any tribes that are fully trying to return to that model. So then it becomes a balance of where, how far is too far away from tradition and into the corporate model, and how far is just enough. There's a lot of community division about that, and that's difficult. But what complicates this further is the fact that government funding is still um, a major part of the puzzle for many, many tribes, and it tends to be a sporadic thing because governments change hands, and funding availability changes, and so many projects just never see their way to completion. And so when a planning committee is put together, it's not about starting from scratch with a field. It's about working with this sort of tattered quilt patchwork, and trying to bring it together into something comprehensive, and then possibly partway through that plan having to reassess again. And even in cases where there's great financial success, um, trying to govern that and come to a cohesive strategy about how the cash flow is going to be regulated and spent, and what possibly new laws have to go in place. Some of this is all very, very new to Indigenous communities, and all just very challenging. So one of the things the paper stressed was the importance of infrastructure, which essentially means having a team at the ready to constantly vote on and provides creative strategies for all these changes that come up, that communities need to adapt to. But I think it's really fascinating to see just how well the Indigenous have dealt with the rather unfair hand they were dealt by the European settlers. So I'm going to put up a couple discussion topics about this rather than having everyone just make their own discussion topic. I'm going to put up 3, and what I need you to do is read 2 of those, read the topic, read all the responses that are in place, and then add something to the discussion. And I'm hoping this will be a little bit more of a conversation rather than just a bunch of random opinions scattered out over the place. So those should be posted somewhere near this video along with the paper, which I do encourage you to read.